Usually when we talk about the law, there is this expectation of tangible boundaries.
Right, like something you can actually see.
Exactly. It functions a lot like real estate. You have a physical fence, the property line is clearly marked by a surveyor, and the law just points at the dirt and says, well, this side is yours, that side is theirs.
It is very geometric.
Yeah, geometric.
Yeah.
And that geometry is comforting because it deals with the physical world. I mean, it is a speed limit sign or a property line or a defined tax bracket.
But the moment you step into the realm of human rights, that physical fence completely evaporates.
It just vanishes.
Completely. We are no longer looking at where your backyard ends. We are looking at the invisible, highly volatile and fiercely contested space between you, a single vulnerable human being, and the colossal, overwhelming weight of state power.
Which is an entirely different landscape.
Oh, absolutely. It is the absolute definition of a structural power struggle, but it is codified into international law.
And that invisible space is exactly what we are mapping out today. We are pulling out the architectural blueprints of international justice.
It is a massive topic.
It is. So for those of you listening who happen to be law students, consider this us stepping in as your personal Osmania University law professors.
Happy to help you prep.
Right. We are going to help you completely dismantle and master Unit I of your syllabus, which covers the meaning, evolution, classification, domestic jurisdiction, and third world perspectives of human rights.
But, even if you have never stepped foot in a law school, if you are just a curious person trying to decode the underlying operating system of global politics, this deep dive is built for you too.
Exactly. We aren't just memorizing definitions here. We are uncovering how these rules dictate the relationship between you and global authority.
And to do that properly, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of foundational sources today.
Yeah, tell them what we have got.
So our primary guide is the comprehensive 2016 Handbook for Parliamentarians. This was published jointly by the Interparliamentary Union and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
It is a dense one, but so important.
Very important. We are also examining the raw, original text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR.
A classic.
Right. And finally, to bring all these abstract global theories crashing down to functional reality, we are dissecting India's landmark Protection of Human Rights Act of 1993.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can debate the mechanics of how human rights law operates or, fails, we have to define the actual object we are talking about.
We need a baseline.
Right. What exactly are human rights, at least according to the United Nations framework?
Well, the handbook provides a very precise starting point, one that really flips the historical relationship between the individual and the state on its head.
How so?
It states that human rights are inherent to all human beings simply by virtue of their human dignity.
Inherent.
Yes. The entire legal foundation rests on that single word, inherent.
So it is built in. Like factory settings. You have them the second you take your first breath.
Precisely. And the legal implication of inherent is massive. I mean, it means these rights are not granted by a ruler.
They aren't a gift.
Exactly. They are not a privilege bestowed upon you by a benevolent government or some generous monarch. And if the state did not give them to you, well, the state cannot legitimately take them away.
Which is crystallized right in Article 1 of the UDHR, right?
Yes. Article 1 reads, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights.
Which, it sounds like a piece of high-minded poetry.
It does sound poetic, but legally it is a radical repositioning of the individual.
Because for most of recorded history, the rights you possess were entirely dependent on an external variable.
Right, your status.
Yeah, they were tied to your social class, your gender, your religion, your race, or honestly, just your specific utility to whoever held the monopoly on violence in your region.
That was the historical norm. But the handbook points out something that elevates human rights from a nice philosophical concept to an active, grinding legal mechanism.
The dual nature.
Yes, the dual nature of these rights. It dictates that human rights delimit state power while simultaneously requiring positive state measures.
Okay, let's break that down, because that dual nature seems like the engine of the whole system.
It absolutely is. It breaks down into negative obligations and positive obligations.
So delimiting state power is the negative obligation.
Correct. It is a boundary. It tells the state, do not cross this line.
Like, do not torture this suspect.
Exactly. Do not censor this independent newspaper. Do not arbitrarily arrest this political activist. The state complies with a negative obligation simply by doing nothing.
By just restraining its own monopoly on power?
Right. just hands off.
That part feels intuitive. I mean, it is a hands-off approach. It is the invisible fence keeping the wolves out of your yard.
Yes, but the positive measures are infinitely more complicated.
Right, because what does a positive obligation actually look like in a legal sense?
A positive obligation means the state cannot just pat itself on the back for leaving you alone.
They actually have to do something.
Yes. The texts state that governments are under a legal obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And that word fulfill is heavy.
What does that actually require from them?
It means the state has to proactively build the physical and administrative environment where rights can be enjoyed.
Give me an example.
Well, consider the right to education. A government cannot just sit back and say, well, there is no law stopping girls from going to school, so our hands are clean.
Right, because if there are no schools...
Exactly. If there are no physical schools built in rural areas, if there is no budget allocated for teacher salaries, or if there are no safe roads for the students to travel on, the right to education is being actively violated through state inaction.
So to fulfill that right, the state literally has to write a check.
They do.
They have to pass a budget, hire contractors, pour concrete, train educators, enforce attendance. I mean, it is basically an invoice handed to the government demanding tangible services.
That is the exact mechanism. And the handbook draws a very sharp, crucial distinction between human rights and other systems of human behavior.
Like religion or ethics.
Right, like a major religion or a general system of ethics. The text clarifies that human rights form the basis for legal entitlements and, most importantly, legal remedies if those rights are unfulfilled.
A remedy. That really is the turning point, isn't it?
It changes everything.
Because if somebody violates a moral code, say they lie to their neighbor, they might face spiritual consequences or social isolation or just get a bad reputation.
But no one is going to jail.
Exactly. But if a human right is violated, the victim is entitled to a court order, they are entitled to financial compensation or a structural change to the law or the imprisonment of the violator. The remedy is what gives the right its teeth.
Because without a remedy, a right is just a suggestion. The possibility to press claims, to stand before a judge or a commission and demand redress, that is what transforms this entire framework from a nice philosophical idea into a binding international mechanism.
I am looking at this like a universal user agreement for being born on planet Earth. You arrive, and boom, you are covered by these inherent protections and these state obligations.
That is a good way to look at it.
But let me push back on this premise right out of the gate.
Okay, go for it.
If this is truly a universal user agreement, why is there constant loud friction on the global stage about these rights?
You mean the cultural pushback?
Yeah. You hear political leaders from various parts of the world argue that human rights are an entirely Western concept. They frame it as a form of cultural imperialism, essentially European and American values dressed up in legal jargon and just forced down the throats of the developing world.
That is a very pervasive structural critique, and the UN Handbook actually does not shy away from it.
Well, they address it directly.
They do. They address it head-on in Box 2 of the text, examining the claim that human rights represent a neocolonial attitude.
And how do they dismantle that?
Well, the expert authors don't just rely on UN talking points. They actually point back to a massive foundational study published by UNESCO in 1968.
A 1968 study seems a bit dated, honestly. What were they looking for, and why does the handbook rely on it to prove universality today?
It might be older, but it was incredibly comprehensive. The UNESCO researchers embarked on an exhaustive global survey. They did not just look at European Enlightenment philosophers.
Right.
They dug into the philosophical, religious, and legal texts of a vast array of cultures and historical periods across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas.
And what did they find?
What they found was undeniable. The profound underlying aspirations of human rights, the deep human desire for justice, the insistence on an individual's physical integrity, the demand for freedom from arbitrary oppression.
All the core stuff.
Right, the right to participate in community decisions. These are not localized concepts. They exist in the foundational literature and oral traditions of virtually all civilizations.
So the desire not to be tortured or silenced is native to the human condition, not to a specific hemisphere.
Exactly. So the distinction we need to make is between the values and the machinery.
The machinery being the treaties and courts.
Yes. The core values are a shared human heritage. But the specific legal machinery, the treaties, the commissions, the courts, Those were heavily shaped by the geopolitical realities of the 20th century, often in Western cities like Geneva or New York.
That makes a lot of sense.
Hmm?
Machinery was built in a specific time and place, but the raw materials belonged to everyone.
That is the exact distinction. Furthermore, the text points out that today the universality of human rights is borne out by empirical reality.
How so?
While the vast majority of sovereign nations on this planet, representing the complete spectrum of cultural, religious, and political traditions, have voluntarily adopted and ratified these main international instruments.
So they signed the paperwork themselves.
They did, often when a state violates human rights. It attacks the concept of universality merely as a smokescreen to justify the violation to the international community.
Right, they hide behind traditional values. I remember the handbook specifically calls out how states have historically justified horrific violations of women's rights like forced marriage or denial of property rights in the name of preserving culture.
And international human rights law provides a very sharp counter-argument to that. It recognizes that culture is not a monolithic, static object frozen in time.
It changes.
Culture is dynamic. So when a government claims a practice is cultural, the human rights framework demands that we ask, who inside that culture holds the power to define it?
Oh, that is a great question.
Right. Is it only the men in power defining what the traditional culture is, at the explicit expense of the women living within it?
So universality pierces through the shield of cultural relativism to protect the most vulnerable individual inside that society.
Exactly. It shifts the perspective completely. It is not about Western culture versus Eastern or Southern culture. It is about power versus vulnerability within any given society.
Okay, so we've established what this framework is and that it really is universally applicable. But this grand machinery didn't just fall from the sky fully formed.
Now, it took a long time.
To truly understand the law, you have to understand the trauma that birthed it. Which brings us to the evolution of human rights. How did humanity actually draft this universal user agreement?
The evolution of human rights is fundamentally a reactionary story.
Reactionary.
Yeah, it is the story of humanity building increasingly desperate guardrails only after repeatedly driving the car off the cliff.
Wow, okay.
The handbook traces the precursors to modern rights back through centuries of legal milestones. It notes the Magna Carta in 1215 in England.
But let's be accurate about the Magna Carta. We mythologize it a lot today, but in 1215, King John wasn't exactly granting universal rights to peasants.
No, definitely not.
He was just conceding some power to a group of wealthy, rebellious barons.
That is true. It was highly exclusionary. But structurally, it established a massive precedent.
The idea that the sovereign is not above the law.
Yes. The king is subject to a legal framework. From there, the text traces the evolution to the late 18th century, highlighting the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789, and the American Declaration of Independence in 1776.
And those documents began to crystallize the idea of individual liberties, right? Like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial.
Exactly.
But there is a glaring structural limitation to all of those precursors. The French Declaration applied to France. The American Declaration applied to America.
Right.
They were purely domestic instruments. If a French citizen's rights were violated by the French state, that was France's business.
And that reflects the reality of international law for centuries. Traditional international law only cared about how sovereign states treated each other.
Like treaties and maritime borders.
Exactly. It governed treaties, borders, and the rules of war between empires. How a state treated its own citizens inside its own borders was entirely irrelevant to the international community.
Citizens were essentially viewed as the property of the state.
They really were.
So how did the individual finally penetrate international law? When did the international community decide that what happens inside the borders is actually their business?
The handbook points to the early 20th century as the moment the old system began to crack. Following the devastation of World War I, we saw the establishment of the International Labor Organization, the ILO, in 1919.
Why labor rights first? Why not civil liberties?
Because the Industrial Revolution had created a newly globalized economy, and massive labor exploitation in one country gave it an unfair trade advantage over others.
Oh, so it was about money and trade.
Largely, yes. The ILO was created to establish international minimum standards for industrial workers, globally restricting child labor, mandating safe working conditions.
So for the first time, an international body was looking past the state and focusing on the welfare of the individual worker.
Exactly. And around the same time, you had the League of Nations minority treaties.
Right, because the map of Europe was completely redrawn after World War I. Empires collapsed, new borders were drawn, and suddenly you had millions of people who found themselves living as ethnic or linguistic minorities in newly formed nation-states.
The minority treaties were an attempt to protect those groups from forced assimilation or persecution. And shortly after that, you had the 1926 Slavery Convention, which committed the international community to suppressing the slave trade.
But I want to pause here for a second. We are looking at the ILO, Minority Treaties, and the Slavery Convention. These are definitely precursors, but the text is very clear that they did not establish individual human rights guarantees as we know them today. Why not?
Because mechanically, they were still state-to-state obligations.
What do you mean?
Meaning a worker couldn't directly petition the international community. Their state had to do it on their behalf.
Oh, I see.
And the minority treaties were deeply flawed. They were politically motivated, imposed mostly on the defeated nations of World War I, and they lacked any universal application. The core doctrine of absolute state sovereignty remained largely intact.
It means a government could still legally do whatever it wanted to its own population, provided it didn't disrupt international trade or cross a border.
Sadly, yes.
So what was the catalyst that finally shattered that old world order and birthed modern international human rights law?
It took the absolute darkest chapter in human history, the horrors of World War II, specifically the Holocaust,
Yeah.
the systematic industrialized extermination of 6 million Jews, along with millions of Romani people, people with disabilities, and political dissidents by Nazi Germany.
And the terrifying legal reality of the Holocaust was that under the traditional rules of state sovereignty, much of what the Nazi regime did within Germany before the war started was technically considered a domestic affair.
That is the horrifying part.
They passed domestic laws, the Nuremberg laws, to strip Jewish citizens of their rights, their property, and their citizenship. Legally, under the old framework, the international community had no standing to intervene in Germany's internal legal processes.
That realization that a sovereign state could use its own domestic legal system to commit genocide against its own people and that the international community was legally powerless to stop it shocked the conscience of humanity.
It proved unequivocally that state sovereignty could no longer be absolute.
Right. There had to be a higher law. This trauma led directly to the creation of the United Nations in 1945, and embedded right there in the very first article of the UN Charter, promoting and encouraging respect for human rights became a foundational purpose of the new international order.
Which brings us to the crown jewel of the texts we are analyzing, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. The handbook notes an incredibly tight timeline here. The UN established a Commission on Human Rights, and under the leadership of figures like Eleanor Roosevelt from the U.S., René Cassin from France, and P.C. Chang from China, they managed to draft this monumental document in just 2 years.
Just 2 years.
By 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted it.
It was an extraordinary diplomatic achievement. I mean, they managed to synthesize wildly different philosophical and political traditions into a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations.
They mapped out civil rights, political rights, economic rights, and social rights all in one unified vision.
But there is a massive catch.
There always is.
The word declaration is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The UDHR was not a legally binding treaty.
Oh, wait. It wasn't legally binding.
No, it was a resolution, a vision board for humanity, if you will. It had immense moral authority, but if a country violated it the next day, they weren't breaking international law.
Wow. So it's just a statement of intent.
Exactly. The plan was always to follow up the declaration with a binding legal treaty, a covenant that states would ratify, committing themselves to actual legal obligations.
Okay, so when did that happen?
Well, the handbook lays out a timeline that is frankly staggering. The UDHR took just 2 years to draft. But to turn that vision board into legally binding treaties took almost 20 more years.
20 years.
The covenants weren't finalized until 1966, and they didn't officially enter into force until a sufficient number of countries ratified them in 1976.
That is nearly a 30-year gap from the promise to the law actually being enforced. Why on earth did it take 2 decades to translate a document everybody had already agreed upon into a binding contract?
Because the world fundamentally changed while they were drafting it. The geopolitical reality of the Cold War descended like a blanket over the UN.
Ah, of course.
The ideological divide between the capitalist Western Bloc, led by the United States, and the communist Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, completely paralyzed the drafting process.
Because they had wildly different definitions of what a right actually was.
Exactly. They prioritized completely different aspects of human existence. The Western Bloc aggressively prioritized civil and political rights.
Like freedom of speech.
Right. To them, freedom meant freedom of speech, the right to vote in multi-party elections, the right to own private property, and protection from arbitrary state power.
Mhm.
They viewed economic and social rights like the right to a job or housing as mere policy goals, not enforceable legal rights.
And the Eastern Bloc looked at that and said, well, what good is the freedom to vote or the freedom of speech if you are starving to death in the street?
Precisely. The Soviet perspective prioritized economic and social rights, the right to employment, guaranteed state housing, free education, and universal health care.
They argued that true freedom required freedom from material deprivation.
Right. And they viewed Western civil liberties as bourgeois illusions that just protected the wealthy.
So this ideological deadlock meant that the member states simply could not agree to put all of these rights into one single, unified, binding treaty.
Neither side wanted to be legally bound to the other's priorities.
So what did they do?
So, to save the project from total collapse, they were forced to split the UDHR's unified vision into two separate, legally binding documents.
A literal fracture in international law.
Yes, they drafted the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ICECR.
And together with the original UDHR, these three documents form what the text refers to as the International Bill of Human Rights.
That is correct.
It is wild to think that the fundamental architecture of human rights today is a direct byproduct of a 1950s geopolitical standoff.
It really is.
But even once those covenants were written down and ratified, the law wasn't frozen in carbonite, right?
Yeah.
The handbook has a fascinating section in Box 15 regarding how human rights jurisprudence operates. It refers to international treaties as living instruments.
That is a vital concept. Because human society rapidly evolves, the interpretation of the law must evolve with it, or the treaties just become obsolete relics.
How does that work in practice?
Well, the treaties established expert bodies and monitoring committees. When cases are brought before human rights courts, the judges give the text dynamic interpretations, adapting the old provisions to modern circumstances.
The text gives a stunning example of this dynamic interpretation. It mentions the prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment under the European Convention on Human Rights, which was drafted way back in 1950.
Think about the societal norms in 1950. At the time that treaty was drafted, corporal punishment and schools teachers striking children with a cane or a paddle for misbehavior was standard, universal accepted practice across Europe.
Right. The drafters of the convention absolutely did not intend for the phrase degrading punishment to outlaw a teacher using a cane.
But decades later, cases started reaching the European Court of Human Rights. And as the treaty lived and breathed, the court looked at the evolving consensus on child psychology and human dignity.
And they changed their mind.
The court ultimately ruled that, actually, state-sanctioned corporal punishment in schools does constitute degrading treatment. The legal standard completely evolved to outlaw the practice, even though not a single word of the original 1950 treaty was changed.
That perfectly illustrates the power of these monitoring bodies and courts. They ensure the law continues to act as a shield against modern realities, not just historical ones.
Exactly.
So because of that Cold War split we just unpacked, we are now left with a very specific, bifurcated legal architecture. That brings us to the next section of our deep dive, the classification of human rights. How do we categorize the rules of engagement today?
Let's break down the categories established in the text, starting with civil and political rights.
This is the category most people instantly recognize when they hear the phrase human rights.
Yeah, it encompasses the right to life, freedom from torture, the right to a fair trial, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion.
And within this specific category, the handbook draws a very sharp, highly technical legal distinction. It divides these rights into two subcategories: absolute rights and rights that are subject to limitation clauses.
Yes.
How does the law prioritize those? I mean, surely you can't equate my right to tweet an opinion with my right not to be tortured in a basement.
You cannot equate them, and the law does not. The distinction is paramount. An absolute right is exactly what it sounds like. It has zero exceptions.
Ever.
Ever. Under any circumstances, no matter how dire the national emergency, the absolute classic example is the prohibition of torture.
Okay, let me present the classic counterargument, the Hollywood ticking time bomb scenario.
Oh, yes.
Right. So a state intelligence agency captures a known terrorist. They have credible, confirmed intel that a nuclear device is hidden in a major city and will detonate in 1 hour, killing millions. The only way to get the location is to use enhanced interrogation techniques, waterboarding, electric shocks on the suspect. In that extreme apocalyptic scenario, surely the law provides a loophole for the state to protect millions of lives.
The law is unequivocal. No.
No loophole at all.
There is no loophole. The handbook explicitly states that the application of interrogation techniques amounting to torture is not justified on any grounds whatsoever.
Wow.
Not to implement counterterrorism measures, not to prevent an imminent attack. It is non-derogable.
Why? That seems completely counterintuitive to state survival.
Because the drafters understood the nature of state power. If you write a loophole into the law that says torture is illegal unless there is a ticking time bomb, then magically every single threat to the state becomes a ticking time bomb.
I see.
Authoritarian regimes will stretch the definition of imminent threat to include political dissidents, journalists, and minor criminals. The moment you legitimize torture under any condition, the absolute boundary collapses, and the state's monopoly on extreme violence is totally unrestrained.
So the law demands an absolute prohibition to preserve the very concept of human dignity.
Exactly.
That makes sense structurally. A crack in the dam eventually breaks the dam. But obviously, most rights cannot be absolute.
Correct. The vast majority of civil and political rights are subject to limitation clauses.
Give me an example.
Freedom of expression is the best example. You have the fundamental right to speak your mind, publish your opinions, and criticize the government. However, your right to swing your fist ends where somebody else's nose begins.
Right.
If you misuse your freedom of expression to incite racial hatred, or to promote war propaganda, or to encourage a mob to commit violence against a minority group, your speech is actively threatening the rights of others.
In that scenario, the government doesn't just have the option to interfere. They have a positive obligation to step in and restrict your speech to protect the public.
Exactly. But the state cannot just silence you arbitrarily because a politician finds your speech annoying or embarrassing. The UN framework places strict boundaries on how a state can limit a right.
What are the boundaries?
The text dictates a three-part test. First, the restriction must be prescribed by domestic law. It can't be a random police order. There must be a clear statute. Second, it must serve a legitimate, specified purpose, such as protecting national security, public health, or the rights of others. And third, the restriction must be proportionate.
Proportionate meaning you don't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You don't shut down the entire internet in a country just to stop one illegal protest.
Precisely. It requires a delicate, constant balancing act by domestic courts. Now, contrast that entire framework of civil liberties with the second major classification, economic, social, and cultural rights, or ESCR.
This is the legacy of the Eastern Bloc's influence, the ICESCR.
Yes. This category includes the right to work, the right to Social Security, the right to an adequate standard of living, which encompasses food, clothing, and housing, the right to education, and the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health.
Going back to our earlier metaphor, if civil rights are the hands-off negative obligations, these are the heavy hands-on positive obligations.
Very hands-on.
Building hospitals, running schools, providing welfare. But the text uses a very specific, almost forgiving phrase for how states are legally required to handle these economic rights, the principle of progressive realization.
It is a pragmatic concession to reality. The United Nations acknowledges the laws of economics. You cannot draft an international treaty, hand it to a developing nation that has just emerged from colonial rule or a civil war, and legally command them to instantly build a world-class, universal, free healthcare system overnight.
Right, it is mathematically impossible.
It is.
So what exactly is the legal obligation, if not immediate delivery?
The obligation is for the state to take deliberate, concrete steps to the maximum of its available resources to progressively realize the full enjoyment of these rights over time.
They have to show forward momentum.
Exactly. They can't just throw up their hands and say, well, we are poor, so we aren't going to try.
I understand the pragmatism, but let me voice the primary critique these rights face in legal circles. Aren't economic and social rights just vague, aspirational policy goals? If the entire legal standard relies on fuzzy terms like available resources and progressive realization, how is it an actual right? How can a judge sitting in a courtroom possibly order a government to cure structural poverty or magically conjure up housing out of thin air? A court doesn't control the national budget.
It is a common critique, but the handbook forcefully debunks the myth that economic rights are too vague to be adjudicated. First, it points out a hypocrisy. All rights, Even the beloved civil rights require massive state resources and policy decisions.
Why so?
Think about the right to a fair trial. To guarantee that civil right, the state has to spend billions building courthouses, paying the salaries of judges and public defenders, maintaining a police force, and running a secure prison system.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
Right, civil rights are incredibly expensive, yet courts enforce them every day.
Okay, I see the distinction. It is arbitrary to say economic rights are unenforceable just because they cost money. But how does a court actually enforce a socioeconomic right without overstepping its bounds and rewriting the national budget?
The text points to a piece of groundbreaking, globally significant jurisprudence to answer exactly that question. It is detailed in Box 12 of the handbook, the Group Boom case.
Let's dive deep into Group Boom, because this case fundamentally changed how international lawyers view socioeconomic rights.
The case took place in the year 2000 in post-apartheid South Africa. The new South African constitution was revolutionary because it explicitly enshrined socioeconomic rights as justiciable, meaning a court could actually enforce them.
Okay.
Irene Grootboom was part of a group of about 900 extremely impoverished people living in an informal squatter settlement called Wallacedean. The living conditions were appalling. It was waterlogged, there was no sanitation, and people were living under plastic sheeting.
Desperate for basic survival, this group eventually moved and built shacks on a piece of vacant land nearby. But that land was privately owned, and it had been earmarked for low-income housing development.
Correct. The private landowner obtained an eviction order. The government bulldozed the shacks, and the community was forcibly evicted.
Where did they go?
They were essentially dumped on an adjacent sports field with absolutely nothing. No shelter, no water, no plan.
The community sued the state, citing their constitutional right to access adequate housing. Now, if I am the government's lawyer, my defense is straightforward. We agree the situation is tragic, but we are a developing nation. We have a massive long-term national housing program in place to build homes over the next 20 years. We are constrained by our available resources. We are practicing progressive realization. We cannot just jump this group to the front of the queue and build them houses tomorrow.
And that was essentially the government's argument. But the Constitutional Court of South Africa dismantled it. The court did not order the government to instantly build Irene Grootboom a permanent brick-and-mortar mansion. That would be overstepping.
Right.
Instead, the court analyzed the government's housing policy and focused on the legal concept of reasonableness.
How do they define reasonable?
The court ruled that a state housing policy is fundamentally unreasonable if it completely ignores the most desperate segment of society. The government had a plan for the medium and long term, but it made absolutely no provision for short-term emergency relief for people who currently had no roof over their heads and were facing crisis conditions.
So they ordered them to act.
Yes. The court ordered the state to devise, fund, and implement a comprehensive program that included immediate relief for those in the most desperate need.
That is a brilliant legal maneuver. The court didn't write the budget, but it placed a legal boundary on how the budget could be distributed. It mandated that the poorest of the poor cannot be excluded from the state's resources while they wait for a 20-year plan to materialize. It proved that socioeconomic rights are not just political wishes. They are adjudicable. A court can enforce them.
It shifted the framework from charity, hoping the government is generous, to justice, where the citizen can demand reasonable action. Now, beyond the civil and economic spheres, the handbook outlines a third emerging category: collective rights.
These are rights that apply to groups or peoples rather than individuals.
Yes. They include the right of peoples to self-determination, the right to freely determine their political status and pursue their economic development. It also includes the right to the free use of their natural resources, the right to peace, and increasingly the right to a healthy, sustainable environment.
We have these three distinct categories, mostly born out of historical tensions. But the text aggressively stresses one overarching vital concept that ties them all together: indivisibility.
Yes, indivisibility.
You cannot pick and choose. And to illustrate this, Box 3 introduces the work of Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate in economics.
Sen's research is absolutely paradigm-shifting. For decades, the global debate was a zero-sum game. Do we prioritize bread, or do we prioritize the ballot box?
Right.
Authoritarian leaders often claim that they must suspend civil liberties, freedom of speech, democratic elections, in order to focus state power on rapidly developing the economy and feeding their people.
They treat civil rights as a luxury item that developing nations can't afford yet.
Exactly. But SEM proved empirically, looking at modern history, that famines do not happen in functioning democracies with a free press and opposition parties.
Let me make sure I understand the mechanics of that. Famines are usually triggered by natural disasters, a drought, a crop failure. How does a free press stop a drought?
A free press doesn't stop the drought. It forces the state to respond to the drought before it becomes a famine.
Ah, I see.
In an authoritarian system without free speech, local officials often hide crop failures to avoid angering the central government. There is no independent media to raise the alarm. By the time the central government realizes people are starving, it is too late. Furthermore, without elections, the dictator doesn't face any political consequences for letting people starve.
But in a democracy, the independent media immediately broadcasts the crisis. The political opposition uses the crisis to attack the ruling party. The citizens use their freedom of assembly to protest.
And because the ruling government wants to win the next election, they are forced to immediately divert resources, mobilize food distribution, and solve the crisis.
Wow.
SEM's research proved that civil rights and economic rights are deeply intertwined. You cannot say, we will focus on the economic right to food first and worry about the civil right to free speech later. Civil rights are literally the mechanical tool required to secure and guarantee economic rights. They are indivisible and interdependent.
Okay, we have covered the meaning, the history, and the classifications. Now we need to transition to the fourth massive pillar of our Osmania syllabus, the balancing act between human rights and domestic jurisdiction.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, we have these brilliant, indivisible international treaties drafted in Geneva. But here's the reality check. If a government violates these treaties, who actually enforces the rules? Does the UN swoop in with blue helmets and arrest the president, or is enforcement strictly a domestic issue?
To understand enforcement, we have to look at a seismic shift in global politics regarding state sovereignty. For centuries, sovereignty meant absolute, impenetrable control within your borders. Human rights were considered a purely internal affair.
Right.
If a dictator abused his own citizens, the international community's default posture was, not our business, it's behind their fence.
But as we discussed with World War II, the fence failed. And unfortunately, it failed again spectacularly much more recently.
Yes. The text highlights that the modern shift in sovereignty wasn't just driven by the 1940s. It was driven by the horrific failures of the international community in the 1990s.
The 1990s.
Specifically, the failure to prevent the genocide in Rwanda, where roughly 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered in 100 days while UN peacekeepers were constrained by their mandates. And the failure to prevent ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, particularly the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia.
The world watched mass atrocities unfold on television, and the old excuse of respecting sovereign borders felt morally bankrupt.
Exactly. The shock of Rwanda and Bosnia led to a revolutionary new concept in international law, officially endorsed by the UN in 2005, the responsibility to protect, commonly known as R2P.
The handbook outlines R2P clearly. It essentially redefines sovereignty. It says sovereignty is no longer just about control over territory. It is about responsibility. A state is primarily accountable for the welfare and protection of its people.
And the crucial pivot is this. If a state manifestly fails to protect its populations from 4 specific egregious crimes, genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity, either because the state lacks the capacity or because the state is the one committing the crimes, the international community has an obligation to step in.
Stepping in could mean economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, or in the most extreme cases, authorized military intervention. It breaks new conceptual ground.
It does.
But, and this is a massive caveat, R2P is reserved for the absolute worst-case scenarios, the apocalypse scenarios. For the everyday, standard realization of human rights, ensuring fair trials, running schools, stopping police brutality, the UN is not coming to save you. The primary duty bearer is always the state.
Which leads to a harsh truth about international law. A treaty signed in Geneva is practically useless unless it is actively downloaded and integrated into domestic law.
It has to be domesticated.
Exactly. Chapter 2 of the handbook heavily stresses the right to an effective remedy. Every individual who claims their rights were violated must have recourse to a competent national, judicial, or administrative authority. International rights live or die in domestic courts.
And this brings us to the crown jewel of our source materials for understanding domestic jurisdiction. India's Protection of Human Rights Act, 1993.
It is a perfect example.
This statute is a masterclass in how a massive, complex, incredibly diverse democracy actually builds the hard machinery required to implement the lofty theories we have been discussing.
The 1993 Act is essentially the domestic engine for the international treaties. Its primary function is the constitution of the National Human Rights Commission, the NHRC, alongside state human rights commissions and specific human rights courts.
Let's examine the composition of the NHRC because Chapter 2, Section 3 of the Act is fascinating. If you're building a commission to investigate the government, the biggest risk is that the government just staffs it with loyal bureaucrats who will rubber stamp abuses.
Right, the cronyism problem.
Yeah. But India engineered the NHRC to be an absolute powerhouse. The statute mandates that the chairperson of the NHRC must be someone who's been a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India.
Let the weight of that requirement sink in. The highest possible judicial pedigree in the nation. It ensures an immense level of political independence. You are not appointing a mid-level administrator. You are appointing a jurist who has spent their career at the apex of the legal system, someone who is accustomed to striking down unconstitutional laws and commanding the executive branch.
And the rest of the panel is equally heavy-hitting. The members include a sitting or former judge of the Supreme Court, a sitting or former Chief Justice of a High Court, and 2 members appointed from amongst persons having knowledge of or practical experience in matters relating to human rights.
Yeah, it is a very serious panel.
Furthermore, it structurally integrates other vulnerable populations by including the chairpersons of the National Commission for Minorities, the National Commission for Scheduled Castes, the National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, and the National Commission for Women as deemed members.
It is an institutional powerhouse designed to command respect from the very state apparatus it is tasked with investigating.
I look at the UN treaties as the global building code. They tell you structurally how a safe society should be constructed, but the NHRC is the local building inspector. They're the ones actually walking the site, checking the foundation.
I like that analogy.
But here is where I always get skeptical about commissions. The inspector can investigate complaints. They can intervene in ongoing court proceedings. But per the 1993 Act, can the NHRC actually punish anyone? If they find a corrupt police unit running an illegal torture black site, can the NHRC directly throw those officers in a prison cell? Or are they just a glorified advisory board making polite recommendations?
That points to the critical structural tension within the Act. The NHRC does not have the power to hand down criminal sentences itself. It is not a parallel criminal court.
So it is just advisory.
However, to call it an advisory board is a massive understatement of its authority. Under Section 13 of the Act, while inquiring into complaints, the NHRC is granted all the powers of a civil court trying a suit under the Code of Civil Procedure.
What does that mean in practical terms? How does a civil court power help investigate a human rights abuse?
It means they have the legal authority to summon and enforce the attendance of witnesses from anywhere in India and examine them on oath.
Oh, wow.
Imagine a local police chief who's used to acting with total impunity in his district. Suddenly, he is legally subpoenaed to New Delhi, placed under oath, and forced to answer questions from a panel led by a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That is a terrifying prospect for a violator.
The Act also says they can require the discovery and production of any document. So the state cannot hide behind internal memos or classified local police reports. The commission can demand the paperwork.
Exactly. They can receive evidence on affidavits, requisition public records from any court or office, and crucially, they have the power to enter any prison, detention facility, or state institution to inspect the living conditions of the inmates and ensure compliance with human rights standards.
They don't need to wait for an invitation to inspect a jail.
No invitation needed.
So they cannot issue the final prison sentence, but they can shine a massive, legally backed, unavoidable spotlight on a violation. They build an airtight, publicly visible case. And then Section 18 outlines the steps after the inquiry. They can officially recommend to the concerned government authority to initiate proceedings for prosecution against the violator. They can recommend immediate payment of compensation or damages to the victim. They can even approach the Supreme Court or the High Court for directions or writs.
What is fascinating here is how the Indian Act perfectly operationalizes the UN Handbook's requirement that states provide a domestic remedy.
Right.
The NHRC holds massive investigative and political weight. If a statutory body headed by a former Chief Justice conducts a rigorous evidence-based inquiry and officially recommends prosecution, it places immense, almost insurmountable legal and political pressure on the state government to act. Ignoring the NHRC carries a heavy political cost. It successfully bridges the gap between the lofty UN treaties and the gritty reality of local jurisdiction.
And the 1993 Act goes even further down the jurisdictional ladder to ensure speed. We know that justice delayed is justice denied, and regular courts are often backlogged for years. Section 30 of the Act mandates the creation of specific human rights courts at the district level.
Yes. The state government, with the concurrence of the Chief Justice of the High Court, can specify an existing court of session in each district to act as a human rights court.
So they localize it.
The sole purpose is to ensure the speedy trial of offenses arising out of human rights violations. They even appoint a special public prosecutor specifically for these cases.
It is a comprehensive domestic ecosystem. From the Supreme Court level down to the district level, it is designed to enforce the international standard. It proves that human rights are not just foreign policy talking points debated in Geneva, they are matters of domestic criminal and civil procedure.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most dynamic section of our Osmeania Unit I syllabus. We have defined the rights, traced their historical evolution, categorized them, and seen how India structured its domestic laws to enforce them. But if we pull the camera all the way back to a macro level, how does the developing world, often referred to in academic and legal contexts as the Third World or the Global South, view this entire international framework?
This is where the consensus gets complicated. Because the foundational texts, the UDHR, the covenants, were heavily influenced by Western powers post-World War II. How does the Global South, which was largely still under colonial rule when the UDHR was written, interact with these laws today?
The Third World perspective is incredibly nuanced. It is crucial to understand that it is not a rejection of human rights. The Global South is not saying, we don't want human rights.
Right.
Rather, it is a profound structural critique of how those rights are defined, prioritized, and applied within an unequal global economic system. The UN Handbook acknowledges this deeply, particularly in Chapter 13.
Right out of the gate, the text does something radical regarding how we define poverty. In Western political discourse, we usually frame extreme poverty as an economic failure, or a stroke of bad luck, or simply a lack of modern development.
Yes, that is the standard view.
But the UN Special Rapporteur, quoted in the handbook, defines extreme poverty as an urgent human rights violation in and of itself.
It is a complete paradigm shift. Poverty is traditionally viewed as the result of a problem. The Third World perspective views it as both a cause and a continuous consequence of human rights violations.
It is a vicious cycle.
The text explicitly states that persons living in poverty generally experience regular, systemic denials of their dignity and equality. It is an enabling condition for a cascade of other violations. When you cannot afford food, your right to health is violated. When you cannot afford housing, your right to privacy and security is violated.
And when you reframe extreme poverty, not as a sad, unavoidable economic reality, but as a structural human rights violation, it changes the required response. It demands a legal and political remedy, not just a charitable donation.
Precisely. And this reframing ties directly into one of the most crucial and fiercely debated concepts pushed by the Global South, the right to development.
Tell me about that.
The handbook highlights the 1986 UN Declaration on the Right to Development. It declares unequivocally that development is an inalienable human right. Every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development.
But the text adds a caveat that strikes right at the heart of global power dynamics. It asserts that to realize this right to development, peoples have full sovereignty over their natural wealth and resources.
That assertion is a direct legal response to the historical legacy of colonialism and the ongoing realities of neocolonial economic exploitation. For centuries, the wealth of the Global South, minerals, agriculture, labor, was extracted to enrich the empires of the Global North.
Right.
The Third World perspective insists that you cannot lecture developing nations about human rights while simultaneously maintaining an international economic order enforced by global financial institutions that systematically drains their wealth and restricts their sovereignty over their own resources.
We also see this distinct perspective shaping the creation of regional treaties. Chapter 8 of the handbook examines how different regions customize the human rights framework to fit their realities. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights is totally unique globally in its structure.
It is structurally fascinating. While Western treaties and the core UN covenants focus almost exclusively on the rights of the individual against the state, the African Charter, adopted in 1981, places equal, prominent emphasis on people's collective rights.
Collective rights.
It legally recognizes the right to equality of peoples, their right to self-determination, their right to freely dispose of their wealth and natural resources, their right to economic, social, and cultural development, and and significantly their right to a general satisfactory environment.
And it goes a step further by explicitly including duties. Western treaties rarely mention duties, but the African Charter acknowledges that an individual does not exist in a vacuum. They exist within a community. It codifies the duties individuals have towards their families, their communities, and the state. It is a much more communal, interconnected framework for justice.
And that framework is actively enforced. The handbook shares a landmark, precedent-setting decision from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the Ndori case, detailed in Box 81.
I want to dig into the details of the Ndoroi case because it perfectly illustrates how these collective rights function in the real world.
The Ndorois are an indigenous pastoralist community in Kenya. For centuries, their lives, their religion, and their cattle-herding economy were deeply tied to the land surrounding Lake Bogoria. But in the 1970s, the Kenyan government decided to create a national wildlife reserve for tourism.
Oh, wow. Let me guess, they evicted them.
They forcefully evicted the Ndori community from their ancestral lands.
And because they were a traditional communal society, they didn't have individual Western-style property deeds for the land. So the government essentially treated the land as vacant state property. The community lost access to their religious sites, their traditional cattle routes, and their economic livelihood.
Exactly. After decades of struggle, the case reached the African Commission, which issued a historic ruling in 2010. The commission found that the Kenyan government had violated multiple rights guaranteed by the African Charter. They violated the right to practice religion, the right to property recognizing communal traditional land ownership as legally valid even without a paper deed, and crucially, they violated the Ndoroi's collective right to development.
The commission ruled that development isn't just about the state building a profitable tourist reserve. It is about the well-being of the specific people living there. By evicting them, without free, prior, and informed consent, and without adequate compensation or a share in the profits of the reserve, the state had fundamentally hindered their development.
It was a major legal precedent. It firmly established that indigenous peoples have collective rights over their traditionally owned land, and that the state cannot sacrifice a minority community in the name of national economic progress.
But let me pause you there. That brings up a massive vulnerability in this framework.
How so?
If developing nations prioritize this collective right to development, doesn't that give authoritarian governments a massive legal loophole? Can't a dictator just say, listen, sorry we restricted the freedom of the press, and sorry we imprisoned those political dissidents, and sorry we seized that community's land, but we are building a massive national highway, a hydroelectric dam, and a new port. We are fulfilling the collective right to development, so you have to excuse our civil rights violations.
That is a very real, very dangerous political rhetorical tactic. But the UN texts, specifically the 1986 Declaration, explicitly and forcefully forbid this interpretation. The right to development is not a license or a blank check for the state to bulldoze individual civil liberties in the name of GDP growth.
How does the law prevent that trade-off?
By defining how development must occur. The Declaration demands a process where all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. The process of development must be based on active, free, and meaningful participation, non-discrimination, and the fair distribution of benefits.
Oh, I see.
If a massive infrastructure project violates the civil rights of a minority, or displaces them without consent, or enriches corrupt officials while impoverishing the locals, that project is not realizing the right to development. By legal definition, it is violating it. You cannot use economic growth as an alibi for tyranny.
Okay, that clarifies the internal state dynamics. But the third world perspective also turns its critique outward, toward the global economic structures governed by the West. The handbook explicitly discusses how international trade agreements impact human rights on the ground.
Yes. Box 39 in the text is absolutely vital here. It discusses the human rights implications of the World Trade Organization's agreements, specifically the TRIPS Agreement, which governs international intellectual property rights and patents.
Right.
The third world perspective demands that international rules on trade liberalization and corporate property rights do not run counter to a state's human rights obligations to its own people.
To make this concrete, let's look at a historical example that perfectly illustrates this clash. The HIV/AIDS epidemic in South Africa in the late 1990s and early 2000s.
A perfect example. South Africa was facing an absolute public health apocalypse. Millions of people were infected with HIV. Pharmaceutical companies in the West had developed life-saving antiretroviral drugs. But because of strict international patent laws enforced under agreements like TRIPS, those companies held a monopoly.
And they priced them incredibly high.
They priced the drugs exorbitantly high, often over $10,000 a year per patient.
Which meant the South African government and its citizens completely lacked the available resources to buy the drugs. People were dying by the hundreds of thousands simply because the medicine was legally locked behind a paywall. So the South African government tried to pass domestic laws to import or manufacture cheap, generic versions of the drugs to save their population's lives.
And the immediate response from dozens of Western pharmaceutical companies was to sue the South African government to block the generics, citing their intellectual property rights under international trade law.
That is terrifying.
It was a direct, terrifying collision. On one side, the Western-backed international trade laws protecting corporate patents. On the other side, the Third World's desperate attempt to fulfill the fundamental human right to health and life for its citizens.
The pharmaceutical companies eventually backed down under immense global public pressure, but approved the point entirely. The Third World perspective insists that what good is a theoretical UN treaty guaranteeing your right to health if the global trade system structurally, legally prevents your government from affording the medicine?
Exactly. The Third World perspective demands that international trade law focus not just on opening markets and protecting patents, but on ensuring health systems, education, and food security are protected. It is a demand for equity at the global table.
Right.
It recognizes that the human rights of an impoverished individual in the global south are deeply structurally impacted by trade decisions made in boardrooms in New York, London, or Geneva. You cannot separate the human rights framework from the global economic framework.
Okay, we have covered an immense, complex landscape today. We have thoroughly executed the Osmania University Unit IA syllabus.
We really have.
Let's summarize the architecture for our listener. Whether you are using this to prep for a high-stakes law exam, or you are simply a citizen trying to navigate the daily news with a sharper, more structural lens, understanding these concepts gives you the code to decode global reality.
We saw how rights must be defined inherently as factory settings, not privileges granted by a sovereign. We traced their painful evolution from the ashes of World War II to the living, breathing instruments they are today.
We classified them into civil and economic spheres, proving through cases like Grootboom and the theories of Amartya Sen that all rights are fundamentally indivisible.
We watched India effectively operationalize these global theories domestically through the heavy-hitting machinery of the 1993 Act.
And finally, we explored how the Global South rightly reframes extreme poverty and development as the ultimate foundational human rights issues. You now hold the complete architectural blueprints of international justice.
It is a powerful tool to have.
It is. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you look at the world today. Throughout this entire deep dive, every source text we examined, whether it was the UN Handbook, the UDHR, or the Indian Act, focused almost entirely on the state.
Yes, the state as the main actor.
The government is viewed as the primary violator and simultaneously the primary protector of human rights. The entire invisible fence of this system was built to contain the power of governments.
Which was the correct model for the 20th century. The state held the ultimate monopoly on power and violence.
Exactly. But look closely at the power dynamics of the 21st century. Today, multinational corporations have GDPs larger than most sovereign nations. Private military and security firms operate in war zones with minimal oversight. And massive, unaccountable tech platforms hold unprecedented, almost sovereign power over our privacy, our freedom of speech, our access to accurate information, and our economic livelihood.
It is a completely new frontier.
They operate seamlessly across borders, mutating and scaling faster than any domestic government can possibly regulate them.
The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are attempting to address this corporate power, but they are largely voluntary frameworks. The hard, binding legal architecture is still desperately trying to catch up to the reality of the digital age.
So as we move deeper into this century, here's the question you have to ask yourself. Is a 20th century legal framework designed entirely to protect us from the overreach of governments going to be robust enough to protect us from the billionaires, the monopolists, and the opaque algorithms of tomorrow?
Are we eventually going to need an entirely new universal declaration to handle the threats of the future?
Think about that invisible fence we talked about at the very beginning. The state isn't the only one trying to cross it anymore.
That is a profound structural question to end on. The law, as we discussed, is a living instrument. It will be entirely up to the next generation of lawyers, policymakers, and informed citizens to force it to evolve and to bend it toward justice.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the structures around you.